Welcome to Work-Life Balance, Survival or Career Suicide, sponsored by the American Bar Association. Moderating the program today is Kathy Morris. Kathy is founder of Under Advisement Limited and former Director of Career Counseling and Placement for Northwestern University School of Law, former Director of the ABA Career Resource Center, and the Center for Continuing Legal Education. She has decades of experience with guiding law students, lawyers, and law firms, focusing on attorney training and professional development. Kathy, you may proceed with the program.
Thanks, Rebecca. Greetings all. I wanted to first have you introduced to our terrific faculty today. You see in your slides a little bit of description of them. Debbie Epstein Henry is an international recognized expert on the retention and promotion of lawyers and work-life balance issues, flex time issues, happiness issues. She's truly a voice in this area, so we're lucky to have her today. She heads Flex Time Lawyers, is the author of a book called Law Reorder, and actually has a newly published book by the ABA, Finding Bliss, Innovative Legal Models for Happy Clients and Happy Lawyers. Happiness is a big subject in science and in psychology and in the lawyer arena these days, so it's great to have her with us. Dr. Larry Richard, and you notice the doctor is not only a lawyer, as is Debbie, but also a PhD in psychology, and a prominent expert on lawyer behavior and on the lawyer brain, which is actually the name of his company. Both Debbie and Larry have practiced law in the past. Larry has worked with prominent legal consulting firms, Altman Weil, Hildebrandt, and it is just a thrill to have him as well. If you've taken one of our programs in the series before, you know that I'm your series moderator. Today I'm coming to you from the Montreal office of the Canadian firm of Blake, Castles and Graydon, which is very exciting. And in my work, I'm a career advisor for lawyers and law students through my own counseling practice. So today we will do, as we always do, run through the top issues and tips to change up the pace, participant questions, agree, disagree, and some takeaways, and talk about some resources of the ABA. So here you see some top issues, and let's get right to it, because I want to make sure we're on the same page with our audience, Debbie and Larry, by asking you each to say a few words about what work-life balance actually is. And Debbie, how would you like to kick us off on that?
Sure, and let me just start by saying I'm really delighted to be part of this program. Thank you for the generous invitation, and thank you to the ABA, of course, for hosting today's topic. To me, work-life balance is really about choice and priorities, and it's about evaluating your interests and your responsibilities on both the work and the home front, and about really being effective in how you choose among those responsibilities on both fronts. It is a lot, again, about priorities in the context of work and life, and understanding that life is about transition, and so a lot of it is about how you manage that flux and the ebbs and flows of the demands outside of the office and inside of the office as you go through your career lifespan. Many people, I think, inaccurately think of work life as sort of a topic that really is about parenting or juggling at that stage of life when your children are perhaps young. This is a gender-neutral issue. This is a reason-neutral issue, meaning it's not just about parenting. And importantly, it's about people during the course of their full career lifespan. It's about, perhaps changes that baby boomers are going into as they transition into retirement. It's about young moms or young dads. It's about law students trying to live an integrated life while they work hard at school and also develop into their future life as lawyers and as people outside of law.
That's right, because all of us are having more and more family responsibilities. It's not just the kids anymore, it's the elderly parents. It's everyone that's affected by all of the kinds of choices and transitions and whatnot. So I think that really helps. Larry, anything you want to add about what your view quickly of what we're talking about today, work-life balance?
Sure. A couple of things, Kathy. And like Debbie, I am grateful for the opportunity, and I thank you for you and the ABA for the chance to participate in this today. I'd add to what Debbie said, and I completely agree with the points that she made. I'd add or reemphasize the point that today the boundaries are disappearing, the boundaries between work and your private life. And as those boundaries disappear, it becomes harder to maintain, quote, work-life balance. It's more about what psychological strategies we employ to regulate ourselves. Self-regulation is a hot topic in psychology right now, and it's the idea that it's actually a part of emotional intelligence, and the idea that a person can, by becoming more conscious, more mindful, more able to focus inward and understand yourself and regulate thoughts that flow through your head, which in turn affect the feelings that you have overall and your mood. Thoughts and feelings are intimately connected, so if you can regulate your thinking, you can regulate how you respond to situations. Even though the situation may be stressful, your internal response need not be. And that's the key, the self-regulation idea and the fact that we can master that through a little bit of training. And that might include things like mindfulness practices, yoga, breathing, meditation. We'll talk about more of those in detail later, but there's a lot of science behind those things which used to be thought of as touchy-feely, and now there's really hard evidence that they matter a lot.
Right, and I really want to ask all of our listeners to kind of keep their minds open, because we're going to go beyond just the language of something like mindfulness. And to do that, Larry, let me ask you this. Being a lawyer psychologist, can you take us into some of the research specific to lawyers regarding balance versus burnout, which I think underlies a lot of the questions regarding whether one is in balance or not?
Well, sure. The first thing to be aware of is that being a lawyer, by necessity, requires us to think negatively. When you practice law, it's incumbent upon you to ask questions like, who's at fault? What are the problems? What could go wrong? What are the exceptions? What's wrong with that statement? Why should I not believe you? We're always looking for problems and things that won't work and things that could get in the way, and we're not spending a lot of time focusing on what works and what's good and what's positive. And focusing on that negative is an important part of the lawyer job, so I'm not for a moment suggesting we don't do that, but I am suggesting that it can cause ongoing psychological problems. Negative thinking is related to depression, and depression leads to, in some cases, to suicide. Lawyers have 3.6 times the amount of depression of the general public, and part of it stems from this training that we have in thinking negatively. We can continue to use that skill when we're wearing our lawyer hat, but we don't need to do it in the other roles that we play. The other thing is that lawyers have a very, very low score in a trait called resilience. Lawyers are very thin-skinned. This surprises a lot of people who are not lawyers, but most lawyers get this, that it's easy to make a lawyer defensive. Lawyers don't rebound well from difficult situations, and psychologically we're defensive. For those lawyers in the audience that are now saying, "Hey, wait 1 minute, what do you think who do you think you're talking to?" That response is itself an illustration of low resilience. So that's the kind of thinking that gets us into trouble. And the good news is resilience is one of those rare personality traits that is much more learned than genetics. So there's things that we can learn, the things that we can teach people to cognitively improve their mastery over things that used to make them feel low in resilience and instead produce a high resilience response.
It's interesting, and I think a lot of this that we'll talk about, too, has such to do with social connections and things that, help us get to the positive. But if all this is true, and there's a lot of good news in there, let me ask Debbie, why, Debbie, do you think there's been such a stigma around lawyers exercising their choices, to find work-life balance? Kind of the career suicide or a survival kind of question.
Sure, and I think this notion of stigma is a huge impediment to lawyers really accessing work-life policies and just otherwise feeling that their legal workplaces are hospitable. I think historically the notion of work-life balance in workplaces has been about accommodation, that a lawyer would ask for a quote accommodation in order to better balance often the family responsibilities at home. And I think that's really a problem with framing, I think, and that has created a lot of the stigma because employers then feel like they're doing employees a favor, and then in a down market or when things get tough, they say, lawyers shouldn't be entitled to such an accommodation. Again, I think this really needs to be reframed, and it has to be designed as a win-win situation. So the threshold issue in my mind around work-life balance is, are you good? Are you someone that your employer wants to retain and promote? Assuming the answer is yes, the next question is, can you design a creative work arrangement that ensures that your quality of work is not negatively impacted, and also, importantly, that colleagues and clients are not negatively impacted? Assuming those issues can be addressed, in my mind, you can design a win-win situation, and that issue around stigma can really fall by the wayside. And in fact, the research really supports this. Interestingly, in a study done a while back, clients were asked, well, how do you feel about working with part-time lawyers? And the client said, interestingly, number one, our outside counsel, essentially all of them are part-time, because what law firm lawyer works for one client on one matter? It's a pretty risky proposition. But also what they said is, we expect the same of our part-time and full-time lawyers. First of all, we expect the quality of work to be top-notch. Otherwise, we expect responsiveness and accessibility. And assuming those criteria are met, we're happy as can be. So a lot of this is around reframing, whether in private practice, whether you're in-house in the legal department, whether you're in government or not-for-profit work. It really doesn't matter. It's about being good and then developing creative solutions that do not negatively impact colleagues or clients.
Right, and I think, that advice feeds into, what Larry was talking about, the sort of a hallmark skepticism in our ingrained legal training toward finding fault. Isn't that right, Larry? That's kind of why this stigma is sometimes, still alive and well when, as Debbie points out, that it really need not be and should not be?
That's right on the money, Kathy. It's the skepticism is one of the key hallmark traits of lawyers, and because skepticism is really the label for what I was describing earlier, that negative thinking that is essential in the practice of law, that spills over into other things, such as evaluating what kind of workplace should we have, or how should we develop and train our lawyers, or what kind of style of communication should we have. That negativity and the skepticism and even the cynicism that it breeds kind of permeates the way that we tend to treat people, the kinds of HR policies that we adopt in law firms. And it's often a reflexive way of behaving. It's not something that we've thought through. If we take the time to think it through, it's easy to see that, especially when you look at the overwhelming research on social connection, which you alluded to a minute ago, the research shows that almost everything that human beings want, whether it's life satisfaction and happiness, work satisfaction, relationship satisfaction, longevity, health, all of those outcomes are predicted by and connected to strong, healthy, ongoing social connections. And we minimize those in a law firm. We act as if it's irrelevant, touchy-feely, not important, silly. And it turns out that we're completely wrong from a research perspective. And this research has been done at both the neuroscience level in terms of brain scans. It's been done in cardiac research. The same results have come through in social psychology. And there are 3 or 4 other areas in psychology. Independent researchers have all seemed to converge on this conclusion that the stronger and the more enduring your social connections are, the healthier, the happier, the more effective, the more engaged a person tends to be. And that, in turn, acts as a cushion. It acts as a way of building resilience so that when you have the stresses of trying to balance your work and your personal life, the more resilient person, i.e. the person who has stronger social connections, is much, much better equipped to roll with the punches.
If I could, Kathy, just jump in, in talking about stigma, I think we would be remiss to not specifically address the billable hour. And if I could just add a couple of quick things on this. I think another significant reason why there's stigma around work-life issues is because of the billable hour, and because generally in the law firm context, a lawyer's value is measured by hours logged. And that can often be inherently contradictory with somebody who wants more work-life balance. And while I know on this call we have a diverse audience beyond law firm lawyers, it really is a big challenge around stigma, this notion of hours logged. So unless we really move away from the billable hour and start measuring lawyers based on results achieved and quality of work and efficiencies rather than time passed, I think this stigma will continue to linger. And one other challenge, and that law firms don't take advantage of, is the one luxury of the billable hour is that firms can generate the same revenue wherever lawyers bill their time. And so at a minimum, while the billable hour is in place, I'm very much of an advocate of firms giving their lawyers more freedom in the way in which they work, particularly because in the billable hour model, it does not impact the revenue model.
Right, and I think, it's interesting, the questions that we have coming in from the audience, which, we're always happy to have, are right along these same lines, kind of, how do you build up resilience? We've talked about that. We're going to talk some more about that. How do law students get a sense that, what's the reality of the challenges of law practice so that they can, make good decisions even at that stage? We're happy to have law students on the call with us. And I also think we have some more senior people on the call, which is great because it's one thing if workplaces have policies to support, work-life balance, but making the environment really hospitable to it, so the lawyers aren't receiving, any kind of poor treatment for exercising their options. That's another real piece of the puzzle. So let me ask you. I guess we'll get to some quick tips in just a minute. But Debbie, let me ask you. Could you give us a concrete example of what progress would look like if legal workplaces and leaders really want to promote actual work-life balance?
Sure. I think most importantly is that we stop focusing on policies for different life stages and instead look at the workplace as a whole and try to design it in such a way that the focus can be on, as I mentioned before, efficiency, quality of work, and results achieved instead of face time and just hours passed. And so a lot of it is, in a law firm context, certainly billing clients differently, and outside of the law firm context, as well as within it, measuring lawyers' contribution differently and being able to say, this is a project completed and this is a job well done or a result that we wanted to achieve, as opposed to we billed this sort of time or that kind of thing. So that's part of it. I think also it's really going to require leaders to be visible on these issues. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of unconscious biases that really result around these work-life issues, and there are a lot of assumptions that are made that are different about men and women, senior lawyers and more junior lawyers. And when leaders can be more out in the open about themselves accessing work-life policies and being able to say, I'm leaving early today to go to my piano concert or to go coach my kid in soccer or whatever it may be, and be visible on these issues, that can be really very important. I think the other thing is to focus on what really contributes to happiness and satisfaction in lawyers, and Larry's done a really nice job of outlining some of those things. And some additional points I'd like to make are when you look at work-life satisfaction, a lot of it is about giving lawyers more flexibility and control in the way in which they work. And so what employers are worried about is, if we are, quote, accommodating on work-life policies, people are going to ease up, they're not going to be as committed and things like that. And in fact, that's not the case. When you give lawyers or other employees more control in the way in which they work, they derive more satisfaction and in turn become more productive and more loyal and more engaged in their work and want to stay there and be invested in their careers and their places of employment more. So being able to afford employees more flexibility and more predictability, and also the ability to be off call. Those kinds of qualities really make a difference in a workplace, and we have to understand, of course, the nature of the work is such that sometimes there is not that predictability. But we could certainly give lawyers a lot more flexibility, control, predictability, and the ability to be off call much more than what is currently going on in workplaces.
Yeah, I mean, Larry, you had a point I think you wanted to make too about, Debbie's made some good ones about, being outside the office and how you're seen and being off call. But what about, actually what could workplace leaders do, even as to inside the office?
So two basic ideas here, Kathy. One of them is, I mentioned earlier the growing importance in the research literature of social connection. We have pretty much ignored that completely from an institutional standpoint in law firms. So, for example, I hear many law firm leaders when I discuss retreats with them. Sometimes I've run into firms who say, well, we haven't had a retreat in 10 years, it's time for one now. Or we don't like retreats because unless we're getting work done, what's the point? And they miss the whole idea that the social lubrication, the connections that people make, not only serves a practical purpose. Yes, I met this person and now I feel like I can pick up the phone and get some referral or get a resource, but there's a psychological benefit to it, a very strong, powerful, important, well-researched, well-documented psychological benefit. This plays a role not just in work-life balance, but it also is something that now a number of insurance companies are looking into because it has a definite impact in loss prevention and risk management. And so what can a law firm leader do, or what can an individual do? Increase the number of social connections you have. That could be as simple as joining a bar association or getting more active in one that you already belong to, or getting involved in an affinity group in your firm, or getting active in committees, or reaching out to people in other practices, and so forth. So that's one thing, is increase the social connection that's not just the kind that is instrumental, meeting somebody for a purpose, but just to connect, just to have that relationship. Number two is, I mentioned at the outset of our call, that mindfulness and other types of practices that allow you to self-regulate are important. There has been growing research in the area of mindfulness. For example, last year there was a book published by Richard Davidson, a prominent neuropsychologist, who wrote a book called The Emotional Life of Your Brain. And he detailed 30 years of research about mindfulness practices and what the science now tells us, especially brain science, which has been growing in leaps and bounds. And it basically shows that the simple practice of some sort of mindfulness, whether it's yoga or breathing or meditation, actually causes physiological changes in the brain for the better, which equip a person, among other things, to roll with the punches under considerable stress. So you may have school loans to pay off. You may have work piled upon you that you need to get done. You may have a lot of deadlines. You may have internal competition with other lawyers for business. All those are normal stressors of the job, but you don't have to react in a stressed-out way to those stressors. So that's the learning from this field, and I'd suggest that people look into whatever mindfulness practice suits their own needs as well. And these things don't take a lot of time. They're things that you can do sometimes during dead time while you're waiting for a plane or while you're waiting to hear back from a client. They're things that could be filling in the gap.
Right, and I think this has helped us, Larry, because we've moved into these quick tips. But before we take Debbie's two, I want to comment on some of these questions we're getting. And, we recognize that there are a lot of big issues in the profession, having to do with the structure of workplaces and the billable hour, and some workplaces having taken steps backward and, really ask for more face time than less. I mean, all those things need to be addressed, but that's why we're talking about them today. So hopefully the people on the phone who can affect some of those changes can do that. We have a law professor who asked how can he help his students understand that working together is really important social connection. We have a number of people who really are asking questions just exactly on what we're talking about. And for those of you who might think, even still, that yoga or meditation or breathing is touchy-feely, I want you to know, Larry mentioned to me that, NYU Law School now has a course on mindfulness, and GW Law School is teaching the principles of positive psychology. And these are not just isolated examples. This is starting to be part of the dialogue. And so while work-life balance may be trending, it's not a fad, it's science. And I would ask all of you to do some of this reading that Debbie and Larry are talking about, to see the research and share it with your students if you're a professor, and share it within your workplaces, up to your executive committees and across to lawyers in the workplace, and try to really take this seriously. And we're glad you're on the call, because it means that you do. So Debbie, that said, how about a couple of quick tips from you?
Sure. I mean, one of the things I see really impeding satisfaction and work-life balance with a lot of lawyers is their own internal dialogue, and really being their own enemy, and whether it's their own guilt or perfectionist qualities or unwillingness to delegate, that can really impede people's satisfaction both at work and at home. And given how great the demands are in both locations, we're at a stage where we really need to ease up on ourselves and our own expectations. So being able to be more decisive and gaining clarity about what is and what is not important, and importantly, where your role is indispensable and where it's not, and regularly reevaluating and saying, okay, 6 months ago I thought I really need to be involved in that project. Now, in fact, I don't, and delegating out where you don't, and really taking more control and being more decisive about the choices that you're making in both venues can really be important. Another thing I think is really important is having much more internal awareness, some of the things that Larry's been touching on, but more specifically I want to add having an understanding of your own strengths and internal rhythms. So for an example, I'm really an early morning person. That's when I do my best thinking. When I wrote my first book, I wrote it from, I got up at 5:30 in the morning because I knew nobody was going to be bothering me then, not even my kids. And if somebody sent me an email, I didn't necessarily have to respond, and that was going to be the block of time in the early morning that I could do my really critical thinking. If I had tried to write that book in the afternoons every day after lunch, it still would not have been written. So understanding sort of the pace of my own schedule, what other expectations are outside of me, can really help with your own efficiency and just operating your day in a more kind of cohesive manner, that you feel that at the end of the day, you're not just having responded to everybody else, but in fact you've gotten some of your own things done on your own list.
I think that's great. These are super tips. I think, some of the questions we're getting really, again, are with the lawyer brain, sort of, well, maybe one of the suggestions for law school is to go to pass-fail, but then how would you get full effort from students if you're just asking them to do passing work? The fact is, I went to a pass-fail law school, Northeastern, and it was people rise to the occasion of learning and conversing and being social, as Larry has also mentioned. I want us to kind of think of the brain and the intention and the mindfulness in new ways. And Larry, somebody asked, what was the name of the book that you had just mentioned? And also, I want to direct you to, Larry has a blog, What Makes Lawyers Tick, and he's going to be doing a lot more writing for the blog in August. And so I want you to look at his articles. We've got a couple posted from Debbie, and the ABA is another one. It's not going to be hard for you to find articles and learning on this. Larry, what was the name of that one book you already mentioned?
I mentioned Richard Davidson's book, which is called The Emotional Life of Your Brain. And the other thing I should mention is I've mentioned several times resilience and how low it is, but how it can be built up. And there is an excellent book by Karen Reivich, that's Reivich, Reivich. Karen is a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, but she's also the chief psychologist for the program that Penn has been hired by the U.S. Army to teach, where they're teaching the Army cognitive resilience skills. And her book, which is called The Resilience Factor, explains 7 different strategies that anybody can use. Just pick up the book and try the strategies out. The key to making them work is repetition. So don't just read the book passively and say, oh, I get that. You actually have to try the strategies until you start building new neural pathways in your brain, and that comes from repetition. and rehearsal.
And,
So,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just also going to say, some of the questions are asking us, well, are you guys telling us that this work-life balance is something that you earn, it's preferential treatment, you be a good lawyer, and then you try to get your balance? I think we're saying that, work-life balance can be for everyone, but part of the social connection, the positive approach is having relationships in the workplace and having people trust you, clients trust you, the lawyers you work with, from the beginning. And I think, yes, sometimes you do need to pay your dues and make your relationships and then ease into it, but you also have to be careful about the patterns that you're setting as you start. Yeah, if you're in a law firm and there are bill of law requirements, we're not saying, go ahead and buck those. We're saying learn about some of the ways that you can meet expectations and also, be in the law for the long run, that you can really handle it all. So let me ask you this, Larry. Let's go to this agree-disagree moment. Some people think multitasking is really important as a way to get through, having to do so many things at once to get out of the office sooner. Do you agree or disagree that multitasking is a key skill for maintaining work-life balance?
Well, I agree that a lot of lawyers think that. I disagree that it's very effective. And that's because, and I'm case example number one. I've been addicted to multitasking for many years, and it doesn't really work very well, and there's science on this, and what the science says is the brain has a finite capacity in what they call working memory, which is the kind of memory that we use to stay focused and be present in our work. And there's only so much that you can pay attention to at one time before you get overloaded. So what happens is when you multitask, you're actually using all of your working memory for one task and then rapidly switching to another task. And each time you switch, there is a penalty, and they call that the switching cost. And what happens is we lose efficiency when we're rapidly going back and forth between two tasks. Our experience feels like we're doing two things at once, but we're never doing them more than a total of 100%. So it might be 50-50 or 60-40 or 70-30, but it's never 100-100. It's never additive. And yet we fool ourselves into thinking that we're very good at it until we crash into a pole. So the evidence is that it's much, much more efficient to do one thing, focus on it, finish it, and then do something else. And that is also less stressful, more relaxing. And the final piece is there's research from Tony Schwartz and the Energy Project that taking breaks, having moments of recovery, even though it seems inefficient to the lawyer's logical mind, why would I take off any time at all? Time that I'm not working is time that I'm not getting things done and I'm not billing. But it turns out that time off, whether it's moments or days or hours or whatever you do, having moments of recovery gives your system a chance to regenerate, to restore. And that's critical in terms of the psychological capacity to tolerate all the ups and downs that we're going through with the rapid change that everybody's experiencing.
Yeah, that's good advice. Debbie, I want to ask you on agree-disagree, but I want to preface this is a statement which striving for work-life balance is survival, not career suicide. Okay, I know you agree with that, but somebody sent in a question that said, look, sometimes lawyers who work off premises miss out on a lot of work opportunities that flow into the office. So are there downsides, and yet does the upside outweigh the downside? Kind of help us out with this in terms of balancing the competing thoughts, even about work-life balance.
Sure, and I think just to start with that, I want to just touch on the multitasking thing because I think it really relates to this issue. I think that one of the things that we're all trying to reconcile here is what we think is best, or what the research supports, and what the reality of our life is dictating, and the real pressures that all of us are facing on a daily basis. So I don't disagree about the stated evils of multitasking, and I've had some of my own mishaps as a result of doing it. And I also very much agree with Larry that there are really important and value in making time for serenity and singular tasks and thinking. But I also want to recognize that we are all under real constraints here, and there is a lot of daily multitasking that we're doing, and really, frankly, our life is demanding that we do. So along those lines, the balance within work-life balance, which is what you've really posed to me, I think, again, you really have to make choices here. So it reminds me, of course, of the Marissa Mayer debate, the Yahoo CEO who declared that her employees could no longer work remotely at all. And I think that there's no need for one extreme or the other. I really want to emphasize that there is a real value of face time. There is a value of colleagues working together and that impromptu discussion that results in the energy that inspires people in a room of interacting, but that there's no sort of rule that says that magic can only happen if people are in the office together 5 days a week from 8 to 6. That's really, in my mind, some artificial framework that was designed in some period of time that we're all feeling in some ways confined to live by still, and that if we don't live by it, then we're copping out or we're uncommitted. So my suggestion along these lines is really making sure that with colleagues there are opportunities to convene in person, to have a community, to have that social connectedness that Larry's been discussing. But there's also true value and in an engagement that results from giving employees more flexibility in the way in which they work, more control in the way in which they structure their day, more flexibility in coming and going. And again, all the caveat here is, of course, colleagues and client deadlines need to be met. And of course, whether it's court deadlines or closings, those requirements have to be met. But within that, giving employees more freedom to work differently is going to enhance satisfaction, it's going to increase productivity, and I believe also profitability.
It's interesting. A solo practitioner just made a good point. It's really hard for solo practitioners when you are the business. It's really difficult to, have to take time off. And again, these are mental disciplines as well. We're not saying, I guess what we are saying is, sometimes when you work, and you don't step back and take these breaks, Larry's talked about, even short ones, you're going to, as we said in the beginning, burn out or make these mistakes for your clients. We lawyers just think that the better answer is to keep our heads down and keep pushing, but actually the tenets of work-life balance we're trying to suggest, help you in your client service and in your progressing in the practice. So, we're not trying to change the whole structure of things today, but we are trying to give you a sense that there's a lot to learn and think about and communicate about in your workplace and beyond. Someone mentioned the value of things like Rotary and other social connections, and so we want to make a point that it's not just within the profession that you spend all your off time either. I think that one quick question before we go to our takeaways. I think this is an intriguing one. Maybe it's for you, Larry. Is social connection also crucial for introverts? Most lawyers are introverts. People don't know that. And they find social interaction draining. And so how do you, work around things like that, or even this thing you said about people, maybe being thin-skinned? I mean, how do you make these kind of attempts to push beyond what you kind of normally would be?
And the answer is yes. Introversion is introverts can feel quite drained when the level of stimuli becomes overwhelming. Introversion is basically the most biological of all personality traits, introversion versus extroversion, and it's regulated by the amount of stimuli that the neocortex, the outer layer of your brain, naturally produces. Introverts produce a much higher level of electrical stimulation than extroverts do. So extroverts seek a lot of stimulation by interacting with people and getting involved in activities to increase the level of stimulation. An introvert, by contrast, has already got a lot of stimulation going on, and they get a little bit overloaded. Their batteries get drained when there's too much interaction. But don't ever think that means they don't need social connection. And when we're talking about social connection, we're talking about the emotional connection between two people, which is usually established face-to-face. It's just that when introverts do establish those face-to-face connections, they need to do it in a way that is mindful of their need for energy management. So they can't have a steady diet of it. They need some break time, some recovery time in between those connections. They prefer those connections to be one-on-one rather than in large groups and crowds, but they need them just as much as extroverts do. And it's just the way that they go about managing the building of those relationships and the maintaining of those relationships that's affected by their psychological preference, not whether they have the connection in the first place.
Okay. Some of the questions as we move to the end of the program really have to do with decisions people need to make about pushing 100% or trying to get a flexible schedule and how it might affect the progression within their own workplace, within the profession. I know, Debbie, there's a lot people can read about that, people's stories and sort of the upside and downside, right? Because we can't, really deal with all the specifics in one quick program. Is that what Law and Reorder is really focusing on, or is there something in particular in addition they could read up on following the program?
Sure. So my first book, Law and Reorder, focuses a lot on these issues, and my forthcoming second book, Finding Bliss, will come out in 2015 by the ABA, will go more into this. But one thing I can say, and I deal with this one chapter in particular of Law and Reorder called Blueprinting for Success, is when lawyers are thinking about their success and their trajectory and balancing, work and life, a lot of times they're very much focused on, well, how much should I work? Should I go flex time or should I go full time, and how many hours do I have to put in? And what I would say is actually take a step back and reflect and realize that what you're ultimately talking about when you're talking about being a good lawyer and being an effective employee is not just that work product. There's a much bigger picture that you can, much bigger package that you can provide as a person, and what those other skills that I'm alluding to that are important beyond a good work product are, being an effective leader and being able to take on leadership responsibilities and assuming an executive presence type of profile, and developing sponsorship relationships, meaning developing strategic alliances that are people who are influential and can really support you and elevate you in your career, and being effective at networking and helping people through networking, and also being effective at self-promotion. And that doesn't necessarily mean being offensive, and of course you don't want to be, but being able to articulate and contribute your value and show your value. Those other components, in addition to navigating work-life challenges, are really, in my mind, what separate out those lawyers who thrive and those lawyers who wither. The ones who have those extras that really, in my mind, are their blueprint for success.
I love all the comments and the questions. Maybe, we actually need another program on this topic, but let me get you to these quick takeaways. If we've covered them, you don't need to mention much. But Larry, you had a quick takeaway advising people to go forth, learn the science.
Yeah, there are two takeaways that I mentioned. One has to do with know what your explanatory style is. This comes from research by Martin Seligman, and originally in a book called Learned Optimism. But the book I mentioned a little while ago, The Resilience Factor, takes Seligman's research and converts it into practical steps. So that's the one I recommend. And it's just basically a series of steps that you can use to change the thoughts in your head, especially the thoughts that you unconsciously have in reaction to adverse events, so that they become less adverse to you. And the book explains how to do that. The second takeaway is really to use one of the mindfulness practices. Somebody asked a question, what is mindfulness? It's really any practice like yoga, like breathing, like progressive relaxation, even exercise can be a mindfulness practice that allows you to focus on the here and now and to basically train your mind to clear itself of distracting thoughts and stay in the present, because that present focus actually relieves stress and makes somebody more centered, and it builds up an actual neurological residue that is healthy in the long run.
Right. I mean, Debbie has an interesting takeaway to build on that, Larry, because replacing your own pessimistic thoughts, she's suggesting you stop being your own enemy. I know we're at closing time, Debbie, but say just a few quick words about that and then your final takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this before, but I think a lot of satisfaction about life is about expectations. And so in being your own enemy, sometimes we're setting the wrong expectations for ourselves. So being able to step back and reevaluate and say, really, what's realistic to expect both in my home life right now or of the people in my life or of my job demands, and setting realistic expectations in relation to what the reality of those demands are, and then gaining more satisfaction in a realistic outlook of how effective you can be in meeting those expectations and adjusting them can be really, really important. And understanding that this is an evolving process. It's not something you figure out and move on. It's something that you're constantly tweaking and reevaluating and reassessing as the demands both inside and outside of your workplace evolve.
Right, and then making the most of your time by repurposing your efforts. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. I know you talked to me about, if you try to build your profile, say it's just a few quick words before I sign off.
Sure. I call this recycling, and this is just being much more thoughtful about the use of your time so that when you do engage in a project that you have to engage on, see how you can get more bang for your buck for those efforts. So if you're required to do an internal presentation to your colleagues, how much work would it take to create that into an article, and then from there to get that article to be published, and then present on a CLE for that. So the idea of taking one effort and then being able to really expand on the impact that it makes so that you can really use your time effectively is something that can really help lawyers as well.
Thank you for all. And in using your time effectively, I want all you listeners to know that the ABA has lots of resources for you. You should look also on our career advice page. But let me caution you, if you've been used to taking these second Friday of the month programs, we love that. But in August, we won't have a webcast. We're going to have a live program at the ABA annual meeting if you're there. And we hope that you can join us for that, and then come back to our regular programming on the web. It's starting again in September on the second Friday, September 12th. So with that said, thanks so much, Debbie Epstein Henry and Dr. Larry Richard. You two are just terrific, and we certainly could talk at length. But look at their articles, look at Larry's blog. And on behalf of the ABA, I'm Kathy Morris signing off. Please stay on the line, and we will give you something to fill in for us, give us some more information about other programs you'd like to see.